Jeff Curto is a photographer, an educator, and a podcaster. He is a Professor Emeritus of Photography at the College of DuPage, where he taught for 30 years. He hosted 2 podcasts, Camera Position and History of Photography. He also leads annual photography workshops to Italy. His photography has been exhibited and collected widely. Today on the Crit House, Jeff Curto discusses his creative influences from Claude Monet, Botticelli, Eugene ET, Olivia Parker, and William Henry Fox Talbot. Jeff Curto, thank you so much for joining us here on the Crit House. So you have, I came to you because I found your YouTube channel on the history of photography, and I started watching and just felt like I learned so much from the discussions you were having and your discussions about history of photography up until the modern day. So I felt honored to have learned so much from you, and that I decided that I actually wanted to talk to you in person.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for having me and inviting me. I'm honored to be in this sort of pantheon of important photographers. I'm sort of at the, at the bottom of that barrel, I think. But hey, I'm happy to be here.
You're also a photographer yourself.
I am. That's sort of how if somebody asks me, what do you do? I say I'm a photographer. And I suppose I've said that out loud to everybody probably but my parents. And since I was 18 or 19 years old, I'm a photographer, and spent most of my photographic career either as I did a lot of commercial work and a bunch of other kinds of things, but fine art photography. But mostly I've been a teacher of photography for a long time, which is how I wound up teaching history of photography, and I'm still teaching.
So you have you went through this process of deciding on 5 images, and I know you've already told me it was a hard process, but like, what did you?
Impossible.
But you did it, success. But what did you? How did you come up with what the 5 images were going to be? Because you've gone in a lot of different ways.
Well, the first thought was, images that I remember from my developmental time as a photographer, and there is one, I think, maybe 2 in the mix that are that. But what I realized, and what I've been realizing even more along the last few years, is how much the total background that I've had in terms of visual arts, both in my long ago distant past and my present, has had to do with the way I think about images in general, image making in particular. And so I really have, so I sort of tried to delve into some of the things that I'm looking over here at these images, delve into some of the things that I have that have been important to my development as a visual person.
And you start with Claude Monet.
I grew up in the Chicago suburbs with a businessman dad and an art loving former second grade school teacher mom. And my mom and I would frequently go from the suburbs down to Chicago, visit the Art Institute of Chicago for, an hour or 2 hours, and then go have lunch with my dad and then take the train back to the suburbs. And so I grew up, this wasn't like weekly, but, every once in a while, once a month, certainly, maybe a couple of times a month, we'd go. And of course, the Art Institute of Chicago, one of the great museums in the world. It really is. I mean, it really is a tremendous museum that is extremely long on my mother's favorite form of painting, which was Impressionism. So we would usually make a beeline for the Impressionist area, and she would talk to me about artwork and about what these artists were doing and so forth. And this is from a very early age, like 7, 8 years old, that I would be going to visit these paintings. And I remember so many of them. This was an interesting early exposure to this kind of artwork. So this is Claude Monet's The Train from Normandy arriving at the Saint-Lazare, I think, station. And the idea of mood and the idea of being able to establish something that felt like the experience would have been if you had been standing there, and that the painting was not about a specific, like you weren't going to be able to pick out a face in the crowd, but what you were going to be able to do is get a sense of what this place felt like if you had been standing there at that time period. That left a big impression on me.
Well, you're so let's go to your second image, which we stick with the canvas, and this is from Botticelli.
So, this is another picture from my relative youth. I saw this first when I was 18 in the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. And this is Botticelli's La Primavera, or Spring. Because of the way in which the Uffizi Gallery in Florence has changed how they exhibit this painting, and because I've now been able to see it many times, what I began to realize was that for something that doesn't look like it really depends at all on detail, this Botticelli guy was just nuts about detail. So, one of the things that I've included here is this detail of the forest floor. And now when I go to see this painting, yeah, I look at the whole thing for a minute or two, but then I just go up and I encourage the students that I encourage them to get right up nose to nose with this and look at what this guy has done with the forest floor and the flowers. And every time I go, I look at this thing, I look at different flowers and different grasses and different plants, and I realize that detail is not the exclusive provenance of the photographer, but it's certainly a big part of what it is that we do as photographers, right? We're so involved in the idea of, now we call it, what do we call it, pixel peeping, right? To
Yep.
go into the image and look at the tremendous detail in an image. But way back in the beginning of photography, that was one of the things that they would do, is that they would go and look at the tremendous detail that they had in the images, and that, there was nothing that the camera saw that they couldn't look at later with tremendous detail. But the idea of paying really close attention to details that matter is really something that's incredibly interesting to me.
And your third from Eugene ET.
The thing about him that I always look at, and it was hard to pick out one because there are so many, and he's definitely one of my desert island photographers that I would take along with me, is, man, the dude knew where to stand. Where do you stand? And where do you stand is the most important thing, I think, in photography.
Hence
You can
camera
keep,
position, right?
yeah, hence
Yeah.
camera position. So you can learn how to do the technology of photography in a couple of afternoons, but the figuring out where to stand and what to stand in front of is really the hard part. And when I look at this picture, I look at just like how big a difference it would make if he was 3 inches or 5 inches or 6 inches to the left or to the right,
Yeah.
or how big a difference just moving the camera up or down a foot would make.
Yeah.
And the alignment of all of these, like, astonishingly perfect cones of shrubbery, and how those line up with the staircase in the back, and the way the one tree lines up against the sky and the receding perspective of the other trees. And really, every time I make a photograph, I'm really thinking consciously, but usually now subconsciously, about the alignment of things, and it's like, look at on the left hand side of this picture, the way he's told us that there is another bush behind the one that's in the foreground
Yeah.
that he could have hidden,
Hmm.
or he could have shown us more of, but he's just showing us enough to let us know, yep, this is another part of this. There's this other tree way behind. And if you look at his body of work, if you look at what he left behind, discovered, by the way, in the middle late part of the 20th century by a photographer named Bernice Abbott,
Yep.
who brought his work to the foreground. People had known about it, but nobody really celebrated it. You look at all of it, and all of it is either about this sort of perfect moment or about a perfect placement of the camera, or oftentimes both.
And now, Olivia Parker. So I saw this here with your other images, and I was I was surprised to see it. I know Olivia because I think she's from the Boston area.
Yeah, yeah, she's
Um,
not far from you.
and so I'm fascinated to hear what you have to
And
say about why this is here.
she's brilliant.
Yeah.
So as a student of photography in the 1970s and 1980s, a series of books of this work that she'd made early on in her career became really important for a lot of us. Occasionally, I'd see at the Art Institute of Chicago an original print or two and be like gobsmacked by how beautiful they were.
Mm.
So, fast forward to 1983, when I was a participant in an Ansel Adams workshop out in Carmel, California, and Olivia Parker was one of the instructors that Ansel had asked to come along. And so I met this woman, and she's absolutely just delightful. And we sort of hit it off as friends, and I got to see a lot of her work and got to know her a little bit. One of the things that I learned about at that point was the idea of how she makes these things, these still life images. So she would just set up like objects that she'd collected from thrift shops and flea markets and whatever, and she'd put them in a window in her house and then put a camera in front of it on a tripod. And every once in a while during the day, she'd look at how the light was affecting it and what would happen if she put objects that would cast shadows and so forth and so on. And it gave me this idea that photography doesn't have to be a place where you go. You don't
Hmm.
have to go.
Yeah.
People say, well, there's nothing around here to photograph, so I have to, go somewhere.
Right.
Like, well, she didn't go anywhere. And she had a terrible skiing accident, which then meant that she was a lot less mobile, even around her own studio.
Mm.
So she switched over from darkroom or large format camera photography to digital photography, which gave her a lot more freedom to be able to do things. She's still working, and I'm not really sure how old she is, but she's easily septuagenarian and perhaps older than that, and is still plowing ahead, man. She's still working, and she's still, as you saw she had this big show and a big retrospective book that came along with it. And, you know, just, I love the idea of like, you just keep going,
Yeah.
keep making. So
Now for your final fifth and final image, we're going back in time in the
way
photo
back in
history.
time, way back
William
in
Henry
time.
Fox Talbot.
So William Henry Fox Talbot, and I included this because it both is a touchstone for me, and also because I have a kind of a more contemporaneous story about this. So this was a picture. It's one of the very first successful images that one of the inventors of photography had made. And so this is William Henry Fox Talbot, a wealthy British citizen who lived in an old converted abbey. When I would teach the history of photography, I would always, of course, include this picture. So now, fast forward to two, 2 years ago, the study abroad program that I teach for in Cortona, Tuscany, starts in Oxford, England. This was the first time I had been to Oxford, and I said to my handlers, my bosses, um, we're not that far from Lake Hawk Abbey, where I've never been. I've never been there, and I'd love to be able to go. It's maybe only 45 minutes, an hour away from Oxford. Would we have any time to go, and could we take some students? And turned out, yeah, we did have some time to go. And it is just a tremendously beautiful little British, town. They have a little beautiful little museum that recounts the history of photography. And then you get to walk and tour the Abbey. And I'm in the Abbey. And of course, I know that this place has sort of the origins of all of these images that this guy made in the 1830s. And I walk around a corner, and I'm just completely, as the British would say, gobsmacked, because I'm standing
There it is.
here in this spot.
Wow.
And it's sort of like being able to stand, at the origin of, I don't know, any form of art. Like, what would it be like if you were in the room where Mozart wrote something?
Right.
and his pen was standing in front of you,
Yeah.
and the paper that he wrote on was sitting there too. I am not embarrassed to say that I was really emotional about this.
Wow.
It really knocked me out. The idea that, I taught about this thing for 30 years without ever having seen it. And then, now I get to see the origin of the thing that I would talk about in a classroom.
Well, Jeff Curto, what a pleasure to talk to you.
What a
And what,
pleasure to
what
do this. A lot of
yeah,
fun.
thanks for coming on. It's been fun not only getting to know you, but learning about the images. I'm always fascinated by how people come, what those images are that brought them to where they are right now. And your stories have helped me understand things that I didn't know before. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me. And I just thought of something, my beef with you
You have a beef?
was, yeah, well, five, as like this last week, as I'm sorting through and like five is not enough. I got to have at least 10, but really five is great. If all of your people watching this go and try and find their five things, five is great because it really makes you whittle down to what it is what brings you to this thing, whatever it is. And it could be photography, could be music, could be anything. Um, so could be food.
Well said. And I'm glad that you don't have a beef with me anymore. I don't.
No, my beef disappeared. So,
Well, again, thank you very much. And
all right. Thanks, Jeff.
thank you all for watching the Crit House.
All right. Thanks again.